Hi everyone, and welcome back to Minds and Machines with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So, apologies first of all that we're getting off to yet another late start this week. For those of you who have seen my announcements on Discord and See You Learn, you'll know why. So I've been dealing with some family stuff, but I'm determined not to fall too far behind. So today we're going to take a look at Aristotle, particularly books 1 and 2 of De Anima. But before we do that, I've got a little bit of housekeeping stuff I want to take care of. So we have to start doing the discussion forums this week, which will be like your participation grade in this class. So starting this week, I will begin creating sort of one discussion thread per week on our discussion forums. I've said in the slides here that this would begin on Monday, but it will probably begin a little bit later, perhaps later Tuesday evening or Wednesday, just because I am struggling to catch up a little bit here with everything that's going on. But in any case, I'll post an announcement once each week's discussion thread is up, and you'll have 7 days to make a post there before I take a tally of everyone who's made a comment or a post of some kind. So what do you have to do in these discussion forums? Well, remember, they're basically a way for you to participate. You know, we're not meeting in person because of COVID-19. If we were, the ideal sort of thing that would be happening is that we'd all be talking together about the readings. Because we've had to do this online, this class is really more of a lecture format than a seminar format, but you can still participate by asking me a question about the material. You could point out something interesting. You could identify something you found confusing. Maybe you want to ask myself or something else about, or someone else about it. You could connect the readings we've done with one another. Make some remarks connecting Plato and Aristotle together, for example, or some commentary on how they're similar and how they're different. You can respond to what someone else has written, so you can answer another student's question, or you can follow up their question with a question of your own. So just think of it like the kind of thing that we'd be doing in a seminar, just moved online. So talking amongst ourselves about the ideas we're encountering in our readings. And of course, keep your writing clear, concise. Everybody be nice to one another. We don't want any flame wars happening in our discussion forums. So that's what this is meant to be, is just a way to participate virtually. Every week you make a post at after 7 days, 7 days after I've started the discussion thread, I'll just go through and see who's made a post. And whoever has gets 1 point for that week to count towards participation. These don't have to be long posts. A couple of sentences is just fine. Just think of it as if you were raising your hand to say something in class if we were all meeting together. What would you say? Would you ask me a question about the material or an assignment, follow up with another question, answer someone else's question while introducing another question? These kinds of things. So that's what I expect you to do. Doesn't have to be, try to make it well written, but I'm not going to grade you on spelling and grammar. It's all about participation. I just want you to show me that you're engaging with the material. So that's what you'll have to do starting this week in the discussion forums. And as I said, I meant to start this Monday, which as of today when I'm filming is Tuesday. So I'll probably start these discussion forums after I film this lecture so that they're up for Wednesday, and then you'll have until next Tuesday to make some kind of comment on the readings. And because we've already talked about a bunch of material, you can talk about anything you like. You could mention something from Aristotle, although you might want to save Aristotle for next time. You could certainly talk about Plato, and you could even talk about some of the things we talked about in our first proper lecture, when we talked about Terry Bisson's short story, and when I gave you a sort of 20th century story of the mind and the mental. Okay, so that's it for the discussion forums. I want to talk about your first reading response now. So again, if you've seen my announcements recently, you already know about this. But I've decided that since I've had to push lectures back a little bit this week, that I would also grant an extension for the first reading response. So instead of February 3rd, it is now due February 5th at 11:59 p.m. on CU Learn. Remember, you're going to want to aim for, something kind of short and sweet, right? You want to aim for probably no more than 300 or 400 words. Even 400 words might be pushing it. You could take 400 words if you like, but I encourage you to try and do it as succinctly and concisely as possible. So you'll want to cite your sources properly as well, in addition to, trying to be clear and concise with your writing. And I don't have a preference on citation style, but the one I myself use the most is APA, the American Psychological Association citation style. And on your slides, as well as in the link below, in the video description, you click that link and you'll go to Purdue University's online writing lab. That was a mouthful. So basically, Purdue's online writing lab, or OWL, provides all these citation guides for free. And the link that I've provided will send you right to the APA style guide so that you'll know how to make your references pages and how to use in-text citations. And you will need to have a references page for anything you even mention. So if you mention the Meno, the Phaedo, De Anima, that needs to go in the references section. If you quote anything or closely paraphrase anything, you need in-text citations. And it tells you all about how to do that, how to properly reference or cite books, articles, websites. It has all the information there. If you're really stuck and you need to cite something that you're really not sure about, maybe there's no instructions on Purdue's OWL for the particular bit of material you want to cite, that's okay. Just let me know and we'll come up with a solution for you. You'll also want to make sure you give your response a short title. Definitely include all of the important student and course information. So you need your name, my name, the due date, and the course code. And it's a good idea to number the pages as well. So definitely do that. I will actually make a template available for when I post this lecture. You can just download that template and kind of fill everything in. This way, everybody's kind of following the same style, right? The same format. It just makes things easier for me to grade. And this way, if you're using the template, you should also all be submitting in Microsoft Word format, because I like to give a lot of feedback and I like to use the comments features and the track changes features in Microsoft Word. So it's just easier for me to give you good detailed feedback if you all submit your work in Microsoft Word format. Okay? So what do you need to do precisely in a critical response like this, or reading response, as I've been calling them? Well, these are just meant to be an exercise in getting you to engage with the material, to engage critically with the material. So you have to choose an interesting aspect from what we've learned and try and engage with it. And you have some flexibility here. For response 1, you could talk about everything from our first proper lecture all the way up to the second lecture on Aristotle, if you want. You could choose anything in there. And you want to critically engage with it. So you want to talk about whether you agree or disagree with the idea and why. Why do you take the stance you do towards the idea? Or you might compare two ideas, try to assess which is better or worse. Whose account of the soul is better from a critical perspective? Plato's or Aristotle's, right? That's the kind of thing that you could do here if you wanted to. Or you could also connect an idea that you've learned outside of this class, maybe something from a different philosophy class, or perhaps from some science fiction you've read or watched recently, and try and incorporate that into some of the ideas that we've been talking about. As long as it's got to do with mind and AI, it's okay to talk about something interesting from outside of the class, as long as you can relate it to what we're talking about and use it as a means of, getting some critical discussion going, right? And the one thing I encourage you to do, even more so than being critical, you should definitely try and critically analyze what we're reading. Don't just tell me what Plato says about the soul or what Aristotle says about the soul. Don't just summarize what we've learned. You will need to do a little summary, but you'll want to tell me how you evaluate these ideas and why you evaluate them the way you do. So do a little critical analysis, but more importantly, pay very close attention to how you write. Try and write clearly and concisely, and try to avoid jargon or big words or wordy sentences. Sometimes by trying to sound a little too smart, we end up sounding dumb, right? Because we use language the wrong way. So I encourage you to actually try and take a simpler approach. To paraphrase Albert Einstein, you should make this as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's what you should be doing here in terms of your writing. If you do want to use big words and technical terms, make sure you're using them correctly. Remember, for example, that a word like idea in this class has a technical meaning. Plato's ideas or forms. It's a technical term for something. So if you wanted to use this word, I have an idea, like I have an idea about Plato, well, I wouldn't put it that way because Plato's ideas are a technical term and we need to use that technical term the right way when you're writing. So watch out for how you use technical terms, large complicated terms. Use a dictionary or a thesaurus if you are not sure what a word means. It will help you sound very clear, make it really, really strong writing, make it really look like you know what you're talking about if you use clear and concise, precise language. Okay? So, I'll be grading you on things like the quality of your writing, spelling, grammar. If I can't understand what you're saying, then I'm going to have to point that out to you and suggest some ways to fix it. So that's fine. Whether you've cited things properly will be very important, and the quality of the ideas that you present in your response. These are short reading responses. You're not writing a fully developed essay here, but you should have good reasons for whatever you say in these reading responses. That's what philosophy is all about. We need good reasons for the things we believe and the things we think, right? Give me those good reasons for what you think about the material in these reading responses. And by the way, do try to organize them if you can, clearly state exactly what you're going to be talking about and how you're going to do it in your first paragraph. Then spend a couple paragraphs talking about it, and then wrap things up with a little paragraph at the end that kind of summarizes everything you've said and restates your conclusion. So that's what I would do. That's how I would approach these reading responses. And I'll create a little template for you all so that you all know where your title goes and where your student information should go, etc., etc. Okay? So that's it for the housekeeping stuff for both the first reading response and the discussion forums. Now we're going to take a look at Aristotle. So we'll recap a few things about Plato's philosophy first, and then I'll tell you a few things about Aristotle's philosophy, and then we'll finally get to De Anima, book 1, a little bit of book 1, and mostly book 2. So let's get into it. All right, so some of the important things that we learned about Plato and his views of the soul and knowledge and learning last time are that knowledge, or episteme, remember the Greeks called knowledge or understanding episteme, is acquired via recollection or anamnesis. So, Plato, through Socrates, is putting forward an argument for something called innate knowledge, knowledge that is present from birth, right? Why do we have this knowledge present from birth? Well, the rational soul, the part of the soul with logos, is a form itself. We learn this in the form of life argument. And knowledge also comes from the forms, and Plato theorizes through Socrates that the immortal divine part of the soul kind of gets this knowledge of everything. At least it gets a priori knowledge about everything from the forms themselves, or the ideas, which are the forms or ideas are noumena, right? They are things in themselves. They are true being or true reality for Plato. whereas the objects in this world are like mere shadows of the forms, This is a mere shadow of the form of the cup, for example. So again, for Plato, to learn, to really gain knowledge, is to recollect. And how do we recollect? Well, we ask people the right questions. We do a bit of dialectic. We introduce people into a state of confusion or aporia, and then the recollection or anamnesis can really begin. And Socrates demonstrates this in Plato's dialogues. As we'll see today, Aristotle parts ways from his teacher, parts ways in many significant ways from Plato. So as we'll see today, Plato and Aristotle depart from one another in quite significant ways. And their differences, together with the legacy that each of their philosophies has had, is really nicely, I guess, captured in this image from a fresco painted during the Renaissance in Italy by Raphael. Raphael painted this. This is the School of Athens. There are all kinds of philosophers depicted. All the classic ancient Greek thinkers are in here. But the two we see in the middle are the two most influential, Plato and Aristotle. Which one is Plato and which one is Aristotle? Well, if you didn't already know, you probably might have guessed that the older fellow pointing up is Plato. He's older, and Socrates was his teacher, and then Plato was Aristotle's teacher, so Aristotle must be the younger gentleman with brown hair. Plato is the older gentleman with the big beard, right? So Plato's pointing upward, and Aristotle's kind of pointing ahead or down to the earth. And this imagery is kind of significant. You'll probably already have a sense of why Plato's pointing up, right? Plato is all about the forms. He thinks true being or true reality is in some kind of, it's a different plane of existence. It's true being, true existence. So when Plato's pointing up, that's kind of a way of Raphael to show us that Plato's not really concerned with the world of phenomena, the world of things as they appear. He's interested in the true reality of the forms. Aristotle, as we'll see, much different. Aristotle's pointing downward, and Aristotle, unlike Plato, who kind of anticipated or foreshadowed things like rationalism, the idea that there is a priori knowledge and that a priori knowledge is innate. That's knowledge that we don't need sense experience to learn. A priori knowledge is something that you could learn by pure deduction, if you like, So Plato is interested in that. Aristotle is not. Aristotle would foreshadow or anticipate the kind of answer to rationalism that appears in the modern period, and that is empiricism. That is that knowledge comes from sense experience. So this is a really significant depiction, kind of the beginnings of two opposite views that we see pop up time and time again throughout history. A priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. What is the nature of knowledge, and how do we come to have it? They differed significantly on this. So Plato is, a rationalist, or at least would foreshadow or anticipate rationalism. Plato was all about a priori knowledge, knowledge that you can have without sense experience, knowledge that is perhaps innate, or knowledge that is deductive. Aristotle is an empiricist. He doesn't think the senses mislead us. Aristotle's attention is very much on the world that we're in right now. Plato's pointing up because he's interested in those pure forms or ideas. Aristotle's interested in the natural world. Aristotle wrote many, many things about many different areas, not just philosophy, but law, politics, zoology. Indeed, his study of the soul was very much part of his biology. He studies the soul as if it's this vital principle, this thing that is what makes life alive, right? It's not some weird, mysterious, ineffable form. It's a thing that living beings have. So that's why Plato's pointing up and Aristotle's pointing down in this picture. And of course, Aristotle would part ways from Plato. He was a student in Plato's academy, left for about a decade to study wildlife, and he would catalog things he found living in lagoons and around the sea and in ponds, and was also a very big fan of vivisection. Vivisection is when you dissect an animal when it's still alive. And, might make your stomach turn. But Aristotle did a lot of vivisection, and that's how he learned a lot about living things. And after his exploits into biology and zoology, Aristotle would go on to found his own university called the Lyceum, which, like the Academy, would be destroyed some years later by the Romans. So, that's about it for the background and recap, I suppose. To understand what Aristotle says in De Anima about the soul, though, we really need to dive into Aristotle's philosophy in more detail and look at the kind of philosophical framework that informed his theorizing about all the different things that he theorized about. So that's what we're going to try to do now. We will have to recap a little bit more of Plato as we go, but we'll try not to repeat ourselves too much, and we'll try to really just understand Aristotle's metaphysics. What is metaphysics? What is the study of reality all about for Aristotle, and how does it differ from the way Plato did it? Let's take a look at that now. Hi. Well, hi. Well, so one of the things that we need to recap a little bit further from Plato, it's concerns some things about the forms. Remember, the forms for Plato are the noumena, right? They are the things in themselves. The forms exist as this kind of, ultimate reality or true being. They are the most real things for Plato. And remember, Plato thought the soul itself was a form, which participates in the form of life, right? And that the interesting conception of God, this capital G kind of God we find in Plato, that might be like a form as well. I was thinking about this the other day. I don't know too much about this, but I know that there's been some speculation on whether this capital G God, this Platonic God of the philosophers, is a form, or whether it's all of the forms, all of ultimate reality or something like that. It's interesting. But in any case, for Plato, form is superior to matter. Matter is really just what we find in this world of appearances. It's a mere phenomena. So Plato is a dualist, right? He's a dualist about the mind and body because he thinks the body is just made of matter. And the mind, at least the rational part of the mind, is the soul, which participates in the form of life. So form is certainly superior to matter on Plato's view. Or forget about souls and bodies and mind-body dualism. Just think about a table, something very concrete like a table. A table is made of matter, and that's pretty important. It couldn't be a table if it wasn't made out of something. But for Plato, what makes a table is that it participates or gets its tableness from the form of the table. There must be a perfect form of the table somewhere. So a table like this can only be a table in virtue of its participation in tableness, which is a thing in itself, right? True being, ultimate reality, it's what's really real, not this table. This table is just mere appearance, a mere shadow of the form of tableness. And remember, of course, for Plato, there are forms for everything, ideas for everything, not just objects like tables and cups, but there's forms, the form of the good, the form of beauty, of truth, justice, and so on. There are forms for everything. Now, Aristotle agrees with Plato to some extent here. He says form is superior to matter. You're right about that, Plato. But forms are not things in themselves. The form of the table is not part of some realm of true being, some noumenal world of ultimate reality. No. Form is important, but it's what form is combined with that's really, really important. Instead of forms, capital F forms, Aristotle will talk instead about particulars or individuals and universals. So a particular would be like this particular table. The university is university. The universal would be similar to what Plato had in mind when he talked about this form of tableness. But universals aren't like this, kind of noumenal object. They're more like a concept that you can grasp with a mind. They don't represent some kind of ultimate reality or realm of pure being for Aristotle. So there's one way they differed. And by the way, Aristotle, as we'll see, did believe in the tripartite soul, just like Plato did, but his version is different. Plato's tripartite soul, we have the appetitive soul, which kind of governs the body's drives and needs, which he thought resided in the stomach. The spirited soul, Plato thought resided in the chest. The spirited soul is, of course, the passions, our emotions. And the rational soul resided in the head. Aristotle names these souls a little bit differently, and he doesn't ascribe to them location within particular parts of the body. So that's one difference to be aware of when you read Plato and Aristotle and compare their views of the soul. Now, when it comes to beings or individuals or particulars, things that exist, when it comes to those, for Aristotle, we can't separate form and matter the way Plato does. So, Plato very famously has, through the character of Socrates, talks about a kind of mind-body dualism in the Meno and the Phaedo. We don't get this kind of thing in Aristotle at all. Aristotle does not agree that form and matter can be separated like Plato thinks they can. Aristotle would say for a table to be a table, it needs the form of the table, yes, but it also needs to be made out of some kind of material out of which you can make a table. So an interesting way of putting this is maybe that, the wood that this table is made out of needs tableness to be a table. The form of a table, a flat surface, legs, so on and so forth. But tableness also needs wood in order for there to be a table. So form is important. It is superior to matter. But what's, I guess, the most real thing for Aristotle, if we want to put it that way, is matter and form. In fact, this view has come to be known as Hylomorphism. That comes from the ancient Greek hyle or hule. We actually don't know how they would have pronounced it. That means matter, and morphe, which means form, like when we talk about things morphing, changing form, metamorphosis, to take a different form. So hylomorphism, matter formism, or matter formness, if you like. This idea of how we can explain existing things in terms of their matter and form, called hylomorphism, is a big theme throughout all of Aristotle's, what is called by Aristotelian scholars his mature theorizing. After he had broken with Plato and really come into his own as a philosopher, hylomorphism permeates his entire philosophical framework, this kind of matter formism, if you like. And all matter, according to Aristotle, also has an inner purpose or end or telos. This view is called entelechy. The the final cause or end or telos that matter possesses is what gives matter the ability to have form. And this will start to make sense if we look at Aristotle's theory of causality. So let's take a quick look at Aristotle's theory of causality now. Often in our everyday lives, when we talk about causality, that is cause and effect, we talk about one event A causing another event B. A big example in at least philosophy that you find starting in the modern period with thinkers like David Hume, for example, is this sort of billiard ball causation. You know, when we talk about cause and effect, we're talking about causal chains, like the cue striking the cue ball, which strikes the 8 ball, which sinks into the corner pocket, right? We're talking about a chain of events where A causes B, causes C, and so on. Aristotle's causality is not really so much about, you know, these cause and effect relations so much as it is about giving a full account of existing things, of beings. If you want to understand any being, you have to understand it in terms of 4 different kinds of causes, says Aristotle, not just one kind of cause. So if you want a complete account of something, you need to explain it with the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. So let's, keeping with the example of tables, try and explain what each of these causes are. Firstly, the material cause. Well, the material cause is what the thing is made of. In the case of a table, the material cause might be wood, right? In my little side table here that I have, it's certainly made of wood. My kitchen table, however, is made of metal and glass. So here we have 2 different tables. They have different material causes, but the material cause of the table is the material it's made out of. Then we have the formal cause. What form does the being take? Well, a table's form is a flat surface with legs. Could be 4 legs like my kitchen table. It could be 4 legs that merge into one and that sit on a kind of circular base like this table right here. There are perhaps different forms that a table could take, but they all have to be supported and have a flat surface so that we can do table-like things with them, right? So far we've got the material cause and the formal cause, which is very closely tied to what I said earlier about hylomorphism. You know, what's really important for Aristotle is matter and form. A being can't have a form if it's not made of matter, and that form can't have beingness if it doesn't have any matter, you know, to do that with, right? A lump of wood is just a lump of wood without the form of tableness, but the form of tableness is just a concept unless someone actually takes that lump of wood and makes a table. Here's where we get to the other 2 causes, by the way. There's also the efficient cause. The efficient cause is an explanation of how the thing you're trying to understand came to be. How was this thing made, or how was it created? How did it come about? In the case of the table, a carpenter must have made it. A carpenter likely made this nice wooden table. My kitchen table? I don't know. Probably a glass worker and a welder made that table, or perhaps a robot in the factory made that table. I'm not sure. But the efficient cause is what brings the being into being, what brings the table into existence. That's the efficient cause. And then finally, no pun intended, we have the final cause, or the telos. What is the end, or purpose rather, of the being we're talking about? What is the table for? Well, tables can be for lots of things. So tables might have different final causes. This table is just for putting nice things on, like lamps and coffee cups. But my dinner table is for eating dinner, even though I hardly ever eat dinner on it. You can have tables for playing Dungeons and Dragons, or chess, or preparing food, or playing ping pong, or for drafting. Any number of things we might design a table for, right? So those are Aristotle's 4 causes. The material cause, what is it being made of? The formal cause, what form has the being? The efficient cause, how did the being come into being? And the final cause, what is the end purpose or telos of this being? That's Aristotle's causality. Now, Aristotle didn't think that everything had all four causes. For example, perfect geometric shapes don't have material causes because we can't really make a perfect geometric shape. They do have formal causes, but who brings the perfect triangle into existence? Well, nobody. Unless maybe God, the God of the philosophers, I suppose. It can also be hard to see, to identify these causes sometimes. Consider animals. Aristotle studied animals. What did he say was the efficient cause of animals? Its parents. So, a little counterintuitive, but yeah, the parents created the offspring, and yeah, they're the efficient cause of those beings. And the final cause is really interesting when it comes to Aristotle's biology, because he saw everything in nature as having a purpose. And this is a view that really dominated biology until Darwin came along. Like, why does the leaf grow there? Well, it provides shelter for the frog. Why are frogs a thing? Frogs feed the storks. So on and so on. So animals, plants, humans, we all have this inner purpose or inner end. And this view would inform biology all the way up until Charles Darwin came along with his theory of evolution by natural selection. That is how influential Aristotle was. So, if you want to understand any kind of being, says Aristotle, you just have to understand those four causes. And if you do that, you've got a nice complete account of the being that you're trying to understand. So, what next? Another important thing you'll want to keep in mind is that Aristotle, of course, placed a lot of significance, or attached a lot of significance, to human reason. This is what separates us from the animals. We have a rational soul, as we'll see when we look in De Anima, whereas animals, says Aristotle, do not. So this is what makes us uniquely human. For example, in Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics, he begins by writing that all men by nature desire to know. We are rational animals. And Aristotle often called human beings rational animals. A being, like an animal with logos, a zoon, ekon, logon. The Metaphysics, by the way, is where we get the term metaphysics from. Aristotle wrote an earlier book called The Physics, which was all about nature. And the Metaphysics, its Greek title just means the books that come after the physics. So that's metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of reality. As we saw before, Plato and Socrates were doing metaphysics when they were talking about the forms and the nature of reality and whatnot. But they didn't call it metaphysics. The term metaphysics comes from Aristotle, and we kind of retroactively apply it to Plato. Similarly, in the Politics, Aristotle writes about how we try to organize ourselves into societies. And the best way to have a good society is to try to have a reasonable society, right? So we are also political animals. We are zoon politikon. We are a human who lives in organized communities. We are social animals, according to Aristotle. All this is possible because we have a rational soul. And Plato, of course, thought we had a rational soul as well. But Plato, as we see when we read the Meno and the Phaedo, thinks the soul is immortal. It doesn't die. It just goes away from the body and retreats back to the forms, and then it's re-embodied later. And of course, if you practice anamnesis and dialectic, you can recollect your knowledge. So that's what Plato thought. So Plato's got an immortal soul. Soul is a different substance altogether than the body. The soul continues to exist after the body has died. Aristotle, recall, thinks that form can only exist within matter. So we need matter and form together to have a being. Hylomorphism, remember? The soul, according to Shields, who's excellent Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Aristotle I will link here, and which I've already linked on See You Learn if you want to take a look at that. Shields describes Aristotle's view of the soul as follows. The soul is the form of a living being, and the body is the matter of the soul, if that makes sense. This sounds a little abstract, but we'll hopefully unpack it once we dive into De Anima. But for now, if the soul is the form of a living body, and a living body is the matter of the soul, it would seem to follow that the soul cannot exist without the body. And this is another area where Aristotle differs from Plato quite significantly. He says that, the soul is basically all the functions and possibilities for a living being. The soul is the potential for life in these things. If you didn't have a soul, you would just be a lump of dead matter, and without matter, there wouldn't be a soul. So Aristotle doesn't think the soul can exist separately from the body, although possibly the intellect or the mind is an exception to this, as we'll see when we dive into Book 3 of De Anima on our next lecture. So Plato's and Aristotle's different approaches toward metaphysics and ontology shaped philosophical debate in these areas for centuries. Thus, Raphael has Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down, and that's also why he has them in the very center of the painting of the School of Athens. Plato is, kind of like an idealist, or, if you like, a Platonic realist. I know that might seem confusing. Usually realism and idealism are thought of as opposites, but Plato was kind of an idealist in the sense that ideas are what are really real, but this is also called Platonic Realism because Plato believed that the forms are what were really real. So sorry if that sounds confusing. Of course, Plato was concerned with the forms, the things in themselves, the noumena, that represented true being or ultimate reality, and his approach here and toward knowledge also anticipated rationalism, where knowledge does not come from the senses. Knowledge comes from the intellect. Knowledge might be innate, or it might be something you can arrive at just by pure deduction without any sense experience. That's rationalism, and that is the philosophical school that Plato anticipated. Aristotle was much more concerned about what we could come to know about using the senses. He didn't think that the senses mislead us or that the body distracts us. So Aristotle's approach anticipated empiricism, which is the view that all knowledge comes from sense experience, and that the mind is kind of like a blank slate at birth, and there's nothing in there at all. So we don't want to get ahead of ourselves here talking about rationalism and empiricism, because we're going to bump into this stuff again when we start talking about Hobbes and Descartes and those thinkers. But it will be a good idea to keep these distinctions in mind when we look in detail at De Anima. So we're going to take a look at some important parts or important ideas from books 1 and 2. We'll just spend a little bit of time talking about book 1 and a bit more time talking about book 2 now. Okay, so now finally we come to De Anima, or On the Soul by Aristotle, where Plato wrote dialogues, these conversations, these dialectical conversations going on between Socrates and his interlocutors. Aristotle takes a different approach. Aristotle just writes treatises, so his writings may seem a little bit drier, a little bit more difficult to get through than Plato's. For example, he begins book 1 thusly. He says, "The knowledge of the soul admittedly contributes greatly to the advance of truth in general, and, above all, to our understanding of nature. For the soul is in some sense the principle of animal life. Our aim is to grasp and understand, first, its essential nature, and secondly, its properties. Of these, some are thought to be affectations of the soul itself, while others are considered to attach to the animal owing to the presence within it of soul." Very different writing style, very dry. But this is basically how his investigation unfolds, you know. In book one, Aristotle kind of goes over the work of some of his predecessors. He talks about a lot of pre-Socratic philosophers here. Mentions Democritus, Empedocles, the Pythagoreans. But he finds their understanding of the soul wanting without getting into too much detail. Basically, this is because they'll say something like the soul is some kind of matter, but the soul can't be matter, says Aristotle, or the soul is fire, or the soul is a number, or something. And he finds something to be desired with all of these ancient Greek views of the soul. So in book two, Aristotle actually goes on to tell us what he thinks the soul is, and he discusses the nature and properties in particular of the sensitive soul and the nutritive soul. So that's what we'll spend the most of our time talking about today. In book three, Aristotle talks about the rational soul, and we'll look at that next time. So I just want to say, firstly, I forgot just how dense some of these readings are when I assigned them. So feel free, at least when it comes to Aristotle, to just go back and look at the sections that kind of, look at the sections where I'm drawing quotes from. You know, use the search feature on your web browser, and you can identify them that way, because this free version doesn't have the Becker numbers in the corner, unfortunately. So it's hard to find the exact passages that way. But just type in the bits I quote, and it will lead you to the relevant passages in De Anima that you can take a longer look at after you've watched this lecture. That is what I would recommend doing if you really want to get the most out of these readings. So, what happens in book one? Well, Aristotle knows he's got a tricky investigation ahead of him. But, he says, we can still understand the operations of the soul. What do souls do, and what are they? If we examine the operations of the soul, or in other words, what things with souls do, we can come to know about the nature of the soul. This is really interesting. Just to make a connection with something we've already learned about, you'll remember the behaviorist psychologists thought that the mind was unobservable, so we couldn't study it scientifically. That was until Edward Tolman came along and learned that there were some aspects of behavior that could only be explained by positing mental representations. So behaviorism, it turned out, had to try and study the mind, and Tolman gave it a way to do that. We had similarly, the developments of Alan Turing and Noam Chomsky gave theorists the idea of computation, which was something that they could apply to the mind, and we could understand thinking and mentation and cognition as a kind of computation. And we could come to know about the mind that way. Aristotle's saying something similar here, it seems to me. You know, we can't directly study the soul, just like the behaviorists thought we couldn't directly study the mind. But if we study the operations of the soul, we can come to know about its nature. Kind of like what Edward Tolman did by studying the behavior of his rats and by looking at how they performed in these mazes. There were certain behaviors he's observed that could only be explained by appealing to mental states, something about the mind that behaviorists thought couldn't be studied. There's a similar kind of thing going on here with Aristotle, which is pretty cool. Oh, hi. Come on. So yes, and then Aristotle talks a lot about the work of his predecessors, who I've already mentioned. The Pythagoreans, Empedocles is mentioned a lot, Democritus is mentioned a lot, but he finds all of this lacking. But whatever the soul is, says Aristotle, whatever it is, all these people I've been talking about are probably wrong, but whatever it is, it's got to be that thing in virtue of which living beings are alive. So whatever a soul is, it's the thing that living beings have, and it is indeed the thing by virtue of which living beings live. Now, I realize that probably sounds a little abstract, so don't worry. We're gonna explain it. We're gonna come back to it, and it'll all make sense by the end of this lecture. Trust me. So in part one of the second book of De Anima, Aristotle begins to actually tell us what he thinks the soul is. I've got a couple quotes here. I'll just read them out loud. And again, look up these quotes, find where they are in book 2, and then read those parts, part 1, part 2. That is how I would recommend tackling this reading if you haven't already. Or if you've tried to read it and found it just too darn dense because it is Aristotle, then take a step back, watch this lecture, and then just focus in on the parts that I direct you towards, okay? So, one quote, what is the soul? What does Aristotle think the soul is? Well, he says at one point in part 1 of book 2, the soul is the first grade of actuality of a natural body having life potentially in it. Okay, it's a little confusing, a little abstract. See if we can break it down with this next quote. What does Aristotle say here? What is a soul? An answer which applies to it in its full extent. It is substance in the sense which corresponds to the definitive formula of a thing's essence. That means that it is the essential whatness of a body of the character just assigned. A body that is organized, an organized body where different parts of the body have different functions, Bodies are organized, Aristotle says, and he points out at the same time that bodies have literal organs. And the organs all seem to have a particular end, or telos, right? The mouth is where we eat, and then the food goes to the stomach, which is for digesting our food, right? This is the kind of thing Aristotle's talking about here. An organized body, a body with organs that fulfill some end. The soul is the essential whatness of that body. It is all of the possibilities and functions of that body. So that's what the soul is for Aristotle, is this essential whatness of living beings. Whoa. Yes, so the soul is the essential whatness of living beings. It's a thing that living beings have. The soul is the thing by virtue of which living things are alive, which is why, unlike Plato, Aristotle does not think that a soul could exist separately from a body. So, what kind of things do things with souls, like living things, what kind of things do they do? I said earlier that, the soul is, the form of an organized body, right? Bodies that have certain functions, that do certain things. What does Aristotle say about this? Well, he says, living, that is, may mean thinking or perception or local movement and rest, or movement in the sense of nutrition, decay, and growth. So, maybe we're living things think and perceive, they move around their environment, but they also, digest food and grow bigger, or maybe they stop growing, or they die and decay, right? To continue, hence, we think of plants as also living, for they are observed to possess in themselves an originative power through which they increase or decrease in all spatial directions. They grow up and down, and everything that grows increases its bulk alike in both directions or indeed in all, and continues to live so long as it can absorb nutriment. So living things can do a lot of things, like think or perceive or move around, or even something as simple as a plant can just, sit there and grow, right? So Aristotle thinks that all living things, from plants all the way up to people, have souls. But because of these different forms of life, the souls that these different kinds of life will have are going to be different. A plant is not going to have the same soul or the same parts of soul that a human will. That's what Aristotle would say. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there may be a bit of an exception going on here in Aristotle's work when it comes to the mind or the intellect. For example, he says, we have no evidence as yet about mind or the power to think. It seems to be a widely different kind of soul, differing as what is eternal from what is perishable. It alone is capable of existence in isolation from all other psychic powers. All other parts of soul, it is evident from what we have said, are, in spite of certain statements to the contrary, incapable of separate existence, though, of course, distinguishable by definition. So the one part of soul that might be able to exist without a body, according to Aristotle, is the intellect. And that's because the intellect can, do things in the absence of, perceiving or engaging with the world. You can still think offline, if you like, without engaging with the world. Whereas to perceive something, you need objects in the world to interact with your sense organs, right? You don't need the same thing to happen with the intellect, says Aristotle. So where sensation and movement and nutrition and all the other aspects of soul require a body of the appropriate form and organization, the intellect doesn't. Now, hang on, you're saying, what about the brain? Aristotle actually did not associate the intellect with an organ of thinking. In the way that we today and Aristotle in the past associated sensation with organs for sensing, sight with eyes, hearing with ears, touch with the skin, and so on and so forth. Aristotle did not make this association between the intellect and the brain, which is interesting. If he had, perhaps he would have gone all the way and said, not even the intellect can survive without the body. He would be very much like a materialist thinker. We'll learn about materialism later on in the class. But anyway, that's the one possible exception for Aristotle of a soul existing without a body, could be the intellect. And that's because unlike, movement, which requires arms and legs possibly, you have to interact with the world, or perception, which requires your sense organs interacting with the world, the intellect does not need to interact with the world in the same way. The intellect is kind of there on its own, regardless of what's going on in the world. So he doesn't tie it to a specific organ of intellect, which probably seems a bit strange to us, what with all we know about the brain nowadays. So anyway, just something interesting to think about. Go back, check that passage out, read it a few times, and see what you think of it. Maybe tell me in an upcoming reading response or in the discussion boards. So after this, Aristotle goes on to talk about nutrition and reproduction, things that all living things do, right? Even plants are capable of nutrition and reproduction. They absorb nutrients from the soil and sunlight and carbon dioxide from the air. That's how they make food. So they grow, they consume all of this stuff, and they'll reproduce. Maybe they'll go to seed. Maybe they'll split off from the main plant and regrow that way. But this all this nutrition, feeding oneself and reproducing, making more copies of yourself, that is the job of the nutritive soul. So the most rudimentary soul in Aristotle's tripartite understanding of the soul. Plants and fungi have this. Aristotle probably would have thought of mushrooms and stuff as plants, but they're actually different. They're not plants. But they do this thing where they grow, they consume nutrients, they grow, reproduce. That's all the province of the nutritive soul. Nutrition, growth, reproduction. All animals have it, especially plants, but also non-human animals and humans as well. Then Aristotle moves on to discuss movement and sensation, and these are the province of the sensitive soul. Plants can't do this, Aristotle says. They can't move and sense like non-human animals can. Humans and non-human animals can do this. Aristotle, of course, didn't know what we know about plants today. When we look at plants in, time-lapse videos, for example, plants seem to react to their environment. They seem to respond to things that happen to them. They just do it very slowly. A great example of this is Heliotrophism. Flowers will open up in the morning and follow the sun across the sky and then close at night, right? Sunflowers do this. They're especially famous for doing this, but all kinds of flowers do this. Plants that grow and climb will also try and avoid obstacles, try and grow in the best way possible. So plants seem to display movement and possibly sensation. If there's something there that is harmful to the plant, they might slowly withdraw and grow in a different direction, right? So had Aristotle had high-speed video back in the day, maybe he would have noticed this, but he didn't. So in any case, the sensitive soul is what makes all of this possible. It's by virtue of possession of a sensitive soul that beings can sense the world and move around in it. So perceive the world and interact with the environment. So only beings with the right kinds of organs of sense, can do this. Plants don't really have any organs of sense. But even the most simplest life forms have some kind of organ of sense, like clams and mussels and things living in the lagoon have a sense of touch, for example. And if you touch a mussel or a clam, it'll retreat into its shell and close its shell up, Aristotle observed. So beings that have a sensitive soul have organs of sense. And note also, I should mention that Aristotle was not like Plato in thinking that the senses deceive us or that the body misleads us. The senses, by and large, deliver us a sort of correct rendering of the way the world is, he said. There are, special cases. Perhaps someone is injured or maybe somebody sees a mirage, but there's always a way we can explain what went wrong. And the senses job, the job of the senses and the sense organs is to accurately allow us to see the way the world is for Aristotle. Nor did he think the body distracts us. Like Aristotle thought, unlike Plato thought the appetites of the body would distract us. Plato thought those were there to tell us important things, or Aristotle rather thought they were there to tell us important things. Like, if you're feeling hungry, well, you should eat something, right? This kind of thing. So this is how Aristotle is kind of anticipating empiricism. The idea that knowledge comes from the senses. Obviously, you couldn't get knowledge from the senses if the senses weren't, at least on the whole, trustworthy, and the body wasn't always distracting us with hunger and thirst and different kinds of physical drives and desires, right? So, there you have it, the nutritive and the sensitive soul. The nutritive soul is what allows us to grow and reproduce. The sensitive soul is the soul that beings with sense organs possess. The sensitive soul allows us to sense the environment, to perceive our environment, and to move around within it and interact with it. For the remainder of Book 2, Aristotle is largely concerned with discussing different senses, which animals have them, which animals have which senses and which animals don't. So he talks about sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing. Some animals just have a sense of touch, as I recalled, and some animals have all of the senses. And some animals, like humans, have really complicated ways of employing their senses along with their intellect, like using their imagination or remembering things, very complicated mental functions that, humans definitely have, and probably that other higher mammals have as well. Okay, so what have we learned so far? Well, we've talked a little bit about Aristotle's metaphysics and how Aristotle differs from Plato, and we've learned a little bit about what Aristotle has to say about the nature of the soul. He talks about three parts of soul throughout Book 2 and Book 3 as well: nutrition, sensation, and the mind or the intellect. And thus, Aristotle's tripartite soul consists of the nutritive soul, the sensitive soul, and the rational soul. Plants only have the first one. Plants are a type of life that only have a nutritive soul. They can only grow and reproduce. Animals have the first two. They have a sensitive soul and a nutritive soul, so they can grow and reproduce, move around, interact with the environment. And humans have a rational soul. We can do philosophy, for example. And of course, nowadays, It's known that other animals do indeed have minds, right? We know that animals are capable of problem solving and remembering. So, where Aristotle was a bit different from the behaviorists by positing that we can study the soul or the mind by looking at what things with minds do, um, he was also kind of similar to the behaviorists in that he thought that humans were the only creatures that possessed a rational soul. He wouldn't have said elephants or great apes or dolphins possess this. Only humans or some other form of life like humans, like possibly some kind of human-like life on another world, would have a rational soul, says Aristotle. So, okay, but still, you're probably feeling like you still don't really know what the soul is, according to Aristotle. If it's not a form of life or some kind of ineffable life force, just what is it? Let's try and clear this up before we wrap it up for today. So Aristotle writes, the soul is the cause or source of the living body. The terms cause and source have many senses, but the soul is the cause of its body alike in all three senses which we explicitly recognize. It is A, the source or origin of movement. It is B, the end. It is C, the essence of the whole living body. And we can make sense of this by going back to hylomorphism, this kind of matter formism, or Aristotle's idea that form and matter together are what are really real. So according to Lawrence, who's written a great Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Aristotle, which I'll link you to here, and which I've also linked you to on See You Learn. Very short, just read the bits I point you to. According to Lawrence, the relation between soul and body, on Aristotle's view, is also an instance of the more general relation between form and matter, hylomorphism. Thus, an ensouled living body is a particular kind of informed matter. So things that are alive have the right kind of form. And this is not form in the Platonic sense. It's form in the Aristotelian sense. Lorenz continues, the soul of an animate organism, in this framework, is nothing other than its system of active abilities to perform the vital functions that organisms of its kind naturally perform. So that when an organism engages in the relevant activities, for example, nutrition, movement, or thought, it does so in virtue of the system of abilities that is its soul. So the soul, according to Lorenz's interpretation of Aristotle, is that system of abilities that enables living beings to carry out the right kinds of activities, namely the activities of living beings. What particular kinds of activities? That depends on what being we're talking about. Because remember, each being has a different telos, or purpose, in Aristotle's philosophy. A frog is alive if it has the right form and its body is carrying out frog-like processes, catching flies and sitting on lily pads and so on and so forth. A stork is alive thanks to the form that its bodily matter has and what it does, right? Flies around, eats some frogs, so on and so forth. And this kind of anticipates a view we'll learn about later called functionalism. Functionalism is a view where we define things in terms of their functions, not what they're made of. People before functionalism really became a thing, which was in the middle of the 20th century, thanks to Hilary Putnam, might have said that to have a mind means requiring a soul, or at least a human-like brain. Functionalism talks about cognition as transition between functional states, computational states. Right? So a mind could be a mind whether it's made out of a brain or computer chips or beer cans. You could make a mind out of any number of things as long as all of its parts function in the right way. Aristotle's kind of saying something about similar about life. And that's really interesting because Aristotle's not studying the soul as if he's just studying the mind. He's more so studying the soul as a branch of biology, right? He's not so concerned, at least not in books 1 and 2, about special mental abilities like memory or thinking or reasoning, so much as he is in explaining the soul as, this kind of animating principle, this thing living beings have by virtue of which they are alive. So it's kind of like functionalism applied to living beings rather than just the mind. But we won't get too far into that today. Just know it's another thing that Aristotle kind of foreshadows that will pop up again in the 20th century. And we'll talk about it more when we read Alan Turing and Hilary Putnam. Anyway, getting back to, hylomorphism and Aristotle's theory of causality. Remember, Aristotle's got these 4 causes: the formal cause, material cause, efficient cause, and final cause. The form is the form it takes. The material cause is what it's made of. The efficient cause is what brought it into being. And the final cause is its purpose, or telos. So remember that the soul is the form of a living body, right? So here, form is to matter as the soul is to the body. You can think about it like this, and this comes from Shields' Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article. You can think of a lump of bronze. That's matter. It only has the potential to be a statue. It needs a formal cause to become a statue. So it needs a formal cause or a form, in addition to a final cause and an efficient cause, to become a statue. It won't be a statue unless we have this form and the matter together. Likewise, a being, living being, which is just made of matter, needs a soul to be alive. This is one way you can think of Aristotle's explanation for what a soul is. It's the form of living matter. Living beings, Aristotle thought, also have efficient causes, like, the parents of offspring are the offspring's efficient cause, and final causes, because remember, Aristotle had a teleological view of nature. Everything was there for a purpose because it was striving to some end, right? After Darwin, we stopped looking at nature this way. It's all just random mutations and natural selection, such that traits that confer benefits preferentially survive. So it's kind of like non-random things occurring on random things, and that's how we see all these different forms of life now, evolution by natural selection. Aristotle didn't think of it that way. But for our purposes, what's important is that, what the form of the statue is to a lump of bronze, to make that lump of bronze into a statue, the soul is that for the matter that living beings are made out of. So the soul is not something mysterious or ineffable or non-physical. It's just, to quote Lawrence again, a system of abilities possessed and manifested by animate bodies of suitable structure. All right. Okay, so we've learned a lot today. I've tried to keep things light, given what's going on in my life right now. And because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I kind of forgot just how tough Aristotle can be to get through sometimes. So feel free for all of the Aristotle readings to just look up the bits I'm talking about and just read those parts, okay? That will probably make your lives a lot easier. And I do recommend that all of you check out the 2 articles that are available on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. One is by Shields, one is by Lawrence. Read those 2. They are short. Just read the sections I've linked you to, and they can help you make sense of some of the more obscure parts in De Anima. I'll try to keep things similarly short and concise when we look at Book 3, which is when we're going to talk about Aristotle's view of the rational soul. But for today, we've learned a bit about Aristotle's metaphysics, and we've learned about the different kinds of soul, or parts of soul, nutritive, sensitive, and rational. And those are the 3 kinds of soul, and we talked about what the nutritive and sensitive souls do. The nutritive soul is responsible for growth and reproduction, and the sensitive soul is the soul that creatures have that can sense their environment, perceive their environment, and move around in the environment and interact with it. We'll talk about the rational soul next time. So that is all for now. I hope you're all doing well. Again, sorry these lectures are a bit late. I'm going to try and have my second lecture on Aristotle up for Thursday, and I'm going to try and keep it a bit short and just stick to the bare necessities. So we'll talk about the rational soul, and I'll try and come up with some more concrete examples to illustrate what Aristotle means by saying that the soul is the form of living matter. So if you have any questions, remember, let me know. Send me an email, hit me up on Discord, or better yet, ask your question in the discussion forums that I will create. I will create the thread for this week's discussion as soon as this video is up, and you can begin participating there and earn yourself some participation marks. Okay? So that's it for today. I'll see you all next time. Bye for now, everybody.